Klezmer music as a term came to existence by Berigovsky. He was the first coin at the klezmer music. He first made a name for it, klezmer music. Proper thing to say, it's a music of klezmorim, the Jewish instrumentalists. Klez is the clay zemer. Clay is the vessel, zemer is song. So the vessel of the song. So instrument. So the klezmer is an instrument. Then they start calling klezmer the people who play this instrument. But in Germany in Middle Ages, Jewish professional musicians also were called letzim, letzt, which is like jongleur, like the troubadour, pagliaccio. So then they start be calling klezmorim. It's a Hebrew term. But the music, they never called klezmer music. Even when I was in Russia, it wasn't called klezmer music.
But just
Jewish music, Yiddish music, or they called it freilichs. Freilichs meaning joyous. Jewish music is also Sephardic music. Jewish music is the music of Falasha, which is Jews from Ethiopia. Music from Yemen, Yemenite Jews. It's also Jewish music. Persian Jews, Jewish music. Iraqi Jews, Jewish music. Mountain Jews from Russia. There's the Jewish music. So Jewish music is music created and played by Jews. Yiddish culture is only group of Jews. It's Ashkenazi Jews that, first of all, spoke Yiddish as their first language. And secondly, they populated Central and Eastern Europe. So it's a very particular thing. And even that is very varied, because what is played now in America as klezmer music, as Jewish music, this is most of it came from the southern, influenced by the Balkan, by Romanian, because when musicians came to America for dancing, they start using music that was used in the South. And since those were the best kind of dance tunes, was more commercial, was more popular. There were also a lot of immigrants that came to America from those parts. They also like to dance. It's the big dance culture, because in the South they danced more. In the North, in the Jewish communities, they were much more restricted by the rabbinical restrictions, because the rabbinical restriction was not to be too joyous. So especially not Hasidic, because Hasidim danced as a religious ceremony, the Hasidic dances. So they had so-called nigun rikud, the nigun, the melody for dancing. And they danced like Sufi, just repeating. So that also influenced a lot. They had the dance as a part of the religious ecstasy. Whereas in Misnagdic communities, that is, traditional Orthodox, non-Hasidic, dancing was not encouraged at all. They allowed to dance a little and during the wedding. That's it. It doesn't mean that Jews didn't like dancing, as anybody else that liked dancing. But there were a lot of restrictions for dancing. The religious Jews were not supposed to dance mixed. So you couldn't, even now it's the same. Women and men don't dance together. So sexual part of dancing, meeting other sex, getting together, dancing with a woman, was not encouraged. So there is a difference between the other cultures that were around, because the peasant dancing, the peasants would get together and dance for that purpose, because that was a way to meet the girls, to do whatever you do. With Jews, it was very difficult. All the marriages were arranged. It was very strict. And in the communities, everything was watched very carefully. So the music was regulated. So when the Jews came to New York, they start using, I give a good example of that, is a dance called Bulgar, that has yap, tari, 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 that we had in Kiev. Those dances were danced in the weddings, even when I was there. But first of all, we never called it Bulgar. That's a name that was given to it in America, or Bulgarish. Maybe they were given it already in the South, because its origin of this rhythm is clearly the Balkan origin, that kind of a combined rhythm. Because the normal kind of Hasidic dance, ta pa 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 sa 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 yata tita tiam pa di diam pa ta di ta ti ai ta da ti ai ta da 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 ta. So this kind of combined rhythm, complicated rhythm, the thing that would go very fast, it's hard to imagine as an old thing in the Jewish tradition up north. That was extracted, mixed with all the other influences, with Hungarians that came to New York, with Romanians that came to New York, with Greeks that came to New York. These musicians had to play for dances in dance halls, specially organized for men and women to get together and dance together for money. They paid to come in. And that was a main job for the musicians in America. So dance music became a main way of earning money in the beginning. That's why the Bulgar, if you look at the books of the early klezmer in America, the huge amount, the percent-wise, the Bulgars would be the more than the others. If you look at the Berigovsky collection that collected in Ukraine, it will be very few Bulgars there. Hardly any Freilichs. The negative thought of the word klezmer, because what happened to the klezmer musicians in the 19th century? I'm very certain, and there is a documental proof of that from the beginning of 19th century to the middle of 19th century, there were not only a lot of Jewish musicians, they had a good percentage of Jews in Ukraine made music their profession. But among them, they were practically the only professional musicians in the territory. And among them, they were fantastic players. How do we know that? We know that from the books. Unfortunately, we have no recording. But if you read the Yiddish literature of the time, would describe what the effect of the music was on people, how music was played, that's a main source that one could take. Also, for example, Mendelssohn writes in his letters about the Jewish musician that toured Europe. We are talking about the late 1820s. His name was Guzikov. He was from the Carpathian area, and he performed on what they called a straw fiddle, which was a strange instrument, as he described, looking like cymbalum, little cymbalum, on the base of the straw with a wooden, like a little xylophone. And he managed to perform the whole performances in public concerts. And Mendelssohn, who was a very sophisticated European musician, wrote that he was so moved by his playing that he doesn't remember being so moved by many a pianist as he was by the playing of this guy. He made a sensation. He was taken all over the place playing. The same thing, there is a memories of the Polish nobility talking about the great violinists, Jews, that they would invite into a castle and the Jew could play for hours for the guests of the nobility, and how the Jewish violin would imitate, not only he could play by ear any kind of tune, but he exhibited incredible virtuosity, and he would imitate any sound in nature. There was a specific kind of mastery of the instrument that these people had, and that was transmitted very high. It was not the same as the village musicians that played in the village dances. The question is, what happened to all of them? And this not to say that there were not klezmorim that played on a very low level, because as now you have Yasha Heifetz and you have some student in some provincial school that hardly can play. But both of them would play something, except that if you would record that, and you record a student who can hardly play, and that would be the only recording left. Our people after us would say, well, in 21st century, that's how they played violin. But it's not true. We simply don't know. All we know is what effect this playing made on people. So you can imagine that the Polish noble people who had an opportunity to listen to all kinds of musicians would not write in their letters or would not mention this mastery of the Jews in any way if they would not touch them. Or Yiddish writers, the same thing. There was Yiddish writers that describe, famous Yiddish writers that describe the effect that music made. So then what happened? What happened that since music was a profession, and people who practiced this profession did that not out of pure love, but made to make money. When, for example, in Odessa, they built an opera theater in 19th century, and they needed to have an orchestra. To be a part of that orchestra, one had to read music. So what the Klezmorim would do, the professional musicians of the area, there would be probably an Italian violinist that was invited. They probably would send their sons, instead of training them in the traditional Jewish way to play traditional Jewish music, they would send to somebody who was a student of Tartini, say, or Viotti. Viotti was in Russia. That's where they would send their sons. They would pay the last money to train the son to leave that thing to play in the weddings and to enter into something that would give them a new prestige. So when the conservatories were organized in Russia, European-style conservatories, where actually one of the greatest violin professor of the St. Petersburg Conservatory was Leopold Auer, was a Hungarian Jew that was invited from Hungary to organize a violin class in the newly founded St. Petersburg Conservatory. And that's what he did. Who was the majority of that violin class, if not the young Jews? Because suddenly Jewish parents saw the new opportunity. And that's the education that would give a profession. That was the main thing. And profession that would give you instant prestige. Of course, the other intellectual professions, like being a doctor, being a lawyer, doing something like that in a society, also would give you a prestige. That's what they did in America when they came. But for that, you have to know the language very well. And you don't have to have discrimination. So you have to be accepted to the university. You don't have to be discriminated in any way for the profession. In Russia, what happened, that with that society, the only profession that you would not be discriminated truly would be music. So there were single Jews that, as an exception, would be accepted to the university. But you see, to be accepted to the university, you had to have a high school diploma. You could not be accepted into university without a gymnasium. To be in a gymnasium, you had to be accepted into the gymnasium, and you had to be a very wealthy person. So if you have a lot of money, like, for example, Jeffrey's grandfather in Berdichev, in a city near Kiev, was sent to the gymnasium and was accepted because he passed all the exams to enter. But he could not study there until his parents had to pay for the Christian student also. And he was responsible for this Christian student, that the Christian student also would pass all the exams. That was a family story. So this is not a theory. That was the family story. In Russia, all the Jews could enter any place if they would convert. Once you convert, everything would be open. That's why it's very surprising that not more people converted. But they didn't, because they felt that was their part of their tradition. That was a big shame to convert. Whereas in Germany, many people convert. In Spain, they were forced. They couldn't stay if they not convert. In Germany, they converted because they became culturally German. because they were emancipated. Like now, for example, a lot of Jews converted. A lot of Jews now in Russia are Christian because culturally, in 20th century, they became very culturally close to Russian culture. But in my time, my grandparents were not close to Russian culture. Their language was Yiddish. Their culture was Yiddish culture. They knew relatively little about Russian culture. They were not influenced by Russian culture. So their religion was Jewish. My grandmother always was telling me that if you won't study, they send me to the music school, of course, for me to enter into the real professional Western music, despite the fact that at home they wanted me to play Yiddish music, because that's still what they prefer. People would come, that's their tunes, that's what I heard all the time. But professionally, they understood that they absolutely didn't want me to be a Yiddish musician. She would always tell me, if you don't practice, you'll become a klezmer. Klezmer for her, in her shtetl, there were proste klezmer, a simple klezmer, and she was saying it like the dirt, somebody who could hardly play. And there were real artists. And so real artist as opposed to klezmer. Real artist, somebody who would really play violin, play instrument, and speak with instrument, and touch people. And the klezmer would just kind of scratch. So that is why I always hesitate. Now, of course, it's not the case at all. Klezmer is a real term. It's a real term for Jewish musician. It's klezmer. It's just that I personally, as the people of the older generation in Russia, klezmer was a negative thing. Because for them, a musician had to read music. And even if it doesn't read music, but is a traditional, but play beautifully, be on a high level, be able to be a master, maestro. I must say that in my experience in Russia with the wedding musicians, they had almost similar kind of feelings. They had somebody who would be used just for dances to accompany. So somebody who could play rhythm. And they were good, but they would just play rhythm. And then there were people that could do all the other things. And those were much more considered. Folk melody is usually a combination of things. It's something that people feel the influences kind of converge, and it makes them remember better. They have to have elements that are memorable. That's why they have to have elements of something that people hear all the time. Military march, since Russian Jews from the time of Nicholas I was drafted into the army. And in the Russian army, Russian Jews tried to be musicians because they hated to shoot. It's forbidden to kill somebody. So whenever they could, they tried to be in orchestras or whatever. So flute, violin, cymbal, all the soft instruments that were used in a traditional Jewish music, when they were taken to the army, somebody who played violin couldn't play violin in the army, but he was a musician. So he would take a trumpet, he would take a clarinet, he would take anything that would be useful, because it was easier for him to learn by ear, and start playing the marches. Because what do you play in the army if not the marches? They learned new instrument. And that's why in the end of the century, from the last 20 years of 19th century, the klezmer bands became much bigger because they suddenly had the brass instruments. They picked them up in the army bands. They had a trombone, they had a trumpet, they had a tuba, they had all of this, which you could play outside. Because you imagine if you play violin and the flute, and the cymbal is very soft. So for that, to compete with that, they didn't have one violin. They had like a whole bunch of violins. There were maybe 3, 4, 5 violins to play all together. So music changed a little bit already by the end of the century, because these band musicians came. Also, Hasidim like the marches because they are rabbis. They want to organize them like an army. They had to do everything together. It was like a sect, because in Judaism that doesn't exist. People never pray all together and never sing all together. No, but in Hasidism, they do all together, because they are tzaddik, they are ahead. They like them to feel all together, to do together. So he liked them sing together in a chorus, and clap their hands together, and march together. So in Hasidic music, there are a lot of music that reminds military marches. For example, they adopted Marseillaise as a Hasidic song. Pam, param, pam, 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 pira, pam. Something like that, something similar to that. They adopted a lot of marches. The New York klezmer scene, Jewish music scene, was very small. So you can imagine that these people, they had a lot of exchange. They constantly played gigs together. They exchanged tunes. They combined tunes all the time. So you take a piece from one and you add to another, because their purpose was to make people dance. The whole purpose of American klezmer music is to make people dance.